It's 4 o'clock. So, welcome back to another week of PPA 500. I hope you've been having a good week so far. Just a reminder that coming due next week, you have a couple of things coming due. You have Canvas essay number two. Canvas essay number two focuses on the principles and the aspect code of conduct that we will discuss in the second half of class tonight. And for that Canvas essay, you're just selecting three of those eight principles that you believe would be the most difficult to implement and discussing why you think those would be difficult to implement. So again, that's Canvas essay number two, which is due next week. And then also your draft advancement candidacy form is also due next week. I know I've gotten a few of those already. If you're not in the program, obviously, I know I've heard from one person already, but if you're not in the program, you don't have to do the advancement form. So just send me an email and I can just exempt the assignment for you. But otherwise, the draft advancement form is just kind of for my eyes only, so I can take a look at your course sequencing and provide you with a little bit of feedback. So that is what we have coming due then for next week. Now, if memory serves correct, and I'm not guaranteeing it does, because as I get older, my memory gets a little bit fuzzier. But if memory serves correct, we kind of had to break before we finish our entire discussion of American government. And if I'm not mistaken, we talked about our system of American government as being predicated upon this entire idea of trying to limit the power of government. That was one of the primary concerns of the framers, especially the anti-federalists, is that they did not want to see a national government become too powerful. They wanted to make sure that those powers resided with the people. And so we had separation of powers, which you talked about last week. There's horizontal balancing of ambition against ambition, balancing three different branches of government with each other, or at least attempting to. And then we also mentioned we had this vertical separation of power, balancing the functions and duties and authority of national versus state governments. But before we get into more detailed discussion of federalism, I think this is really a good time for us to take a step back and really talk about this issue of the word power. Because we threw the word power around a lot last week. We're going to talk about power going forward in a lot of different contexts, whether it be in terms of talking about accountability and ethics, or talking about theoretical approaches to public administration. So it's probably good that we take a few minutes and really talk about what we mean by the word power. And so just to start tonight, my question for you is very simply, what is power? So you can give me a very simple definition of the word power. You can use text chat, the microphone, however you're comfortable, but what is power?
The ability to control or dictate an outcome or a result.
Sure, absolutely. The ability to control some type of an outcome, to try and influence some type of an outcome. I think those are both important parts of this term that we call power. I think with power, we are looking at the ability of one person or one party to influence another party to do something they otherwise would not do. And oftentimes, in order to exert that influence, we are utilizing resources. So, a very basic definition of power that I really like is the use of resources to influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do. Because obviously, if that person would take that action anyway, there's no reason to use resources to try and influence them. So, or influence them to do something that they otherwise would not do. And oftentimes, we use resources in order to accomplish that. I think that's a pretty good basic definition of the word power. However, I always like to dig a little bit deeper. And here I like to dig a little bit deeper into the multifaceted nature of the term power. So, power, there can be different types of power exercised in different types of ways. So, what I want to do is introduce you to a study by a social scientist by the name of John Gaventa. And I'll be putting some things in text chat and again, talking while I type. So, I apologize for any typos. But John Gaventa. John Gaventa was very interested in this idea of power and how and why some people and some groups were able to influence others to do something that perhaps might not be in their own self-interest. So what Gaventa wanted to do is, like a lot of social scientists, he wanted to do some case studies. So he did a case study of a coal mining town in rural Kentucky and a case study of a coal mining town in rural Tennessee. He picked those towns because those towns, as coal mining towns, they were essentially pretty much owned by the coal mine companies. And so in those towns, you had miners who were working in these mines for very long hours, sometimes 70 and 80 hours per week. They were working in very dangerous mine conditions. And if you've read anything about the process of coal mining, you know that coal mines can be very dangerous. And a lot of people have lost their lives down in a coal mine. And one of the most dangerous aspects of a coal mine is the propensity for those mines to explode. And so, whenever you're down in the mine back in the old days and you had your metal pickaxe and you were hitting your pickaxe against the rock, whenever the metal would hit the rock, it would cause a spark. Though also you have a release of gases down in the mine. And so we all know what happens whenever you are in a place that's full of gas and then there is an ignition. Causes an explosion. The explosion, if it didn't kill the miners immediately, it then led to a mine collapse that eventually would trap and kill the miners. So it was a very dangerous type of work conditions, and they were working in those conditions 70 and 80 hours per week. There is a very simple process that the coal mine owners could have used in order to kind of tamp down this risk of an explosion. And it was a very simple process and a cost-effective process known as dusting of the mines. So in dusting of the mines, you would go down there and you would dust the walls of the mines. And by dusting the walls of the mines, then you are really reducing the likelihood that there would be a spark, an ignition point. And so if you can reduce or eliminate the ignition point, then you're going to greatly reduce the potential for an explosion and a collapse. Now, the coal mine owners knew about mine dusting. However, they didn't want to spend the money to dust the mines. And so the mines were never dusted, and so they were very dangerous working conditions. Add on top of that, the idea that these miners, when they were getting paid by the coal mine owners, they were not getting paid in money. They were getting paid in tokens. Those tokens could only be redeemed at one place, and that was the general store. That general store was owned by who? The coal mine owners. And so you had these miners working very long hours in dangerous mine conditions, getting paid in tokens as opposed to getting paid with money. Clearly, those things run counter to the self-interest of those coal miners, but those coal miners were willing to do it. And Gaventa said they were willing to do it because the coal mine owners were successful at exercising power over those workers. And his two case studies led him to the development of his theory that's called the three faces of power. And by face, he's basically just referring to it as a type. So basically, three different types of power. The first face or the first type of power is what Gaventa would argue is the least dangerous type of power. And that's what I refer to as overt power. In overt power, you have one party influencing the actions of another party, but both parties know what's going on. So the party who's doing the influencing knows what they're doing. The party that's being influenced knows that they're being influenced. And so everyone knows what's going on. It's out in the open. Because everyone knows what's going on and it's out in the open, it is the least dangerous type of power because both parties are fully informed about the exercise of power. The second face of power is more hidden, and so therefore it's more dangerous. And that's what he referred to as a mobilization of bias. Mobilization of bias is essentially what we refer to in policymaking as agenda setting. So this is when we set the agenda to decide what issues go on to the formal decision-making agenda of a state legislature, for instance. This is something the coal mine owners were using very effectively. Because the coal mine owners, because of their deep pockets, they were able to influence the members of the state legislature to keep mine safety legislation off the agenda of the state legislature. If mine safety legislation never gets on the agenda, then there'll never be any votes or discussion of it, and there'll never be a policy on mine safety. So through those campaign contributions, that political type of influence, they were able to keep mine safety off the legislature's agenda. All the coal mine workers knew is that there was no new legislation coming out of the state legislature to regulate the safety of mines. They didn't know why. They just knew they were getting no new protections. So it's hidden. They didn't understand that this agenda setting was going on. So that's agenda setting, the second phase known as mobilization of bias. Then the third phase of power, Gaventa argues, is by far the most dangerous, and that's what he called co-optation. Co-optation is the most dangerous because the person who is being influenced, the persons whose opinions are being co-opted, doesn't realize that that's taking place. So in co-optation, you have one party that is able to replace the opinions of the other party with their own. So the coal mine owners were able to convince the coal mine workers that yes, indeed, working 80-hour weeks in dangerous mine conditions, getting paid in tokens to be spent in the general store, all of those things were actually in your best interest as a worker, and they were able to displace the rational self-interest of the coal mine workers with their own as the owners. So they co-opted the opinions of the miners. What Gaventa found is phases 2 and 3 were the two phases of power that were going on in this extreme exercise of power in these two coal mining towns. Well, I think I've already told you that my favorite question in all these classes is, well, so what? Okay, that's a really interesting theory about three different phases of power, but so what? How does that help us in this class as well as in our study of public administration? It helps us in this class because as we move forward in our ensuing weeks, we are going to talk again and again about power and authority. So when we talk, after our break tonight, when we talk about ethics and accountability, we will talk about the incumbent responsibility of public servants to utilize the authority that they have been endowed with in a responsible manner. So when you are working in the public sector, you are working in an agency that was created through enabling legislation that was passed by a legislative body. You are implementing policies and programs that were created through enabling legislation through the legislative body. So therefore, you have this inherent power and authority that has been bestowed upon you. So we'll talk about that in ethics and accountability. When we talk about differences between public and private sectors next week, we'll talk about the difference in authority in power between public and private sector organizations, and so on and so on. So power is a recurring theme. So whenever we talk about power, I think it's important for us to go back to this definition and say, well, what type of power is actually being used? And secondly, I think it's important for your time in the MPA program because it really does illustrate that this term power is multifaceted. It is multidimensional. It's not an either or. Well, either they're using power or they're not using power. We can dig a little bit deeper and say, well, what type of power is actually being exercised? How are they exercising this influence over someone else? So hold on to these three faces of power that John Gaventa provides to us because we're going to be returning to those throughout the rest of this class, and hopefully it'll be something that will be useful to you as a theory as you move on throughout the MPA program. So now we have an idea about this power as being something that is more than just a binary dichotomous situation. It's actually, you have different types and gradations of the exercise of power. That discussion of power is then useful for us as we talk about our system of American federalism. So I think we already covered last week separation of powers, and we have a pretty good idea of the separation between legislative, executive, and judicial. And that's what we talk about most commonly in our discussions of American politics. What we don't talk about as frequently is the discussion of the vertical separation of powers in our system of American federalism. So let's talk a little bit more about our system of American federalism, how powers are distributed among national, state, and local governments, and how those power relationships have changed over the past 200 years. If you find this information on federalism interesting Every summer, we offer an asynchronous course, PPA 535, Intergovernmental Relations, that looks at these issues of federalism, and it will allow you to delve in a lot more detail into the relationship between different intergovernmental levels. But this system of federalism, as we know, was established under our Constitution, and it was something that was really pushed for very strongly by the Anti-Federalists. Anti-Federalists, as we talked about last week, really believed in states' rights. And they believed that states were sovereign entities, and those states needed to retain their sovereignty. And so they really wanted to see provisions in the Constitution that provided for rights to state governments. Now, the way in which federalism is built into our Constitution is our system of federalism only looks at two levels of government, the national government versus the state government. When we start to add local governments into the equation, that's when instead of talking about federalism, we oftentimes refer to it as intergovernmental relations. And that's the reason why the PPA 535 course is called Intergovernmental Relations, because we talked very extensively about local governments and how they relate to the national and state government. But in our Constitution, and we'll talk about the Constitution in a few minutes, but in our Constitution, we have several provisions that were in there to try and ameliorate the concerns of the Anti-Federalists, and we have other provisions in there that were for the Federalists. So, for instance, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution enumerates powers to Congress. Whenever you enumerate something, you are listing it. So we have all these enumerated powers that Congress has: establishing post offices, raising armies and navies, declaring war, coining money, levying taxation, regulating interstate commerce, regulating piracies and punishment of counterfeiting, and creating all courts inferior to the Supreme Court. All those are powers that are specifically listed, specifically given to Congress in Article 1, Section 8. In Article 1, Section 8, by listing those powers, that was a nod to the Anti-Federalists. Because the assumption is if a power is not listed, then that power does not belong to Congress. And in the absence of it belonging to Congress, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution tells us that it then belongs to the states or the people. Diego asked a good question in text chat. Is there any reason why federalism did not include local government relationships? And that's a good question. It's because most things revolved around the state. And so local governments were then and still today are considered to be creatures of the state. There's an important federalism principle that's known as Dillon's Rule. And it's called Dillon's Rule because it was promulgated by a judge. I believe he was from Iowa in the 1900s by the name of Dillon. And Dillon's Rule says that local governments are creatures of the state, local governments are created by the state, local governments are empowered by the state, and local governments can then be destroyed by the state. So the focus in the founding of the nation was really at the state government level, far more so than any types of local organizations. So it really was a focus on state governments at the founding of the nation. And then still today, under constitutional law, local governments are still considered to be creatures of the states that created them. If the state government has the ability to create a local government, the extension of that is the state government then has the ability to eliminate a local government if it sees fit. And we have seen some states eliminate local governments. One prominent example of that was from the state of Texas. And a few decades ago, the state of Texas decided it had way too many local school districts. It has, I forget how many, something like 1,300 or something local school districts. And it decided we are going to eliminate some of those school districts through consolidation and cut the number of school districts down by, I think, 2/3 or something like that. Here in California, we've had a couple of examples. The state legislature, or at least contemplating taking incorporation status away from some local governments. Vernon was one of those governments that, if you're familiar with the city of Vernon, not a whole lot of people live in Vernon. Vernon is primarily a commerce and industry, and so there are questions in the state legislature about should it be its own city since you don't have that many people living there. Yurupa Valley for a while was contending with their incorporation status, as well as there are people in the legislature who wanted to take incorporation status away from Europa Valley. So states can eliminate local governments. And so that's a probably long-winded explanation for how local governments are part of the state. So they're kind of subsumed within the state.
Thank you. That answered my question. Thank
Good, good. But that's a great question. Yeah. But if you go on and take the PPA 535 class, we will talk a lot about local governments, and we'll talk a lot about some of the reasons why local governments are more prominent in certain states as compared to other states based on political culture and a lot of other types of factors. So we've got this balance that we're having between the national government and state governments. Article 1, Section 8 has the enumerated powers, a nod to the anti-federalists. But when we look at the Constitution a little bit later on, we will see at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we then have the elastic clause of the Constitution, otherwise known as the necessary and proper clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in it by the Constitution. In other words, Congress can do anything that Congress needs to do to allow it to carry out its enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. That is a very broad grant of authority to Congress, and in turn, a broad grant of authority to the national government. So even in Article 1, Section 8, we have some language that really kind of pushes against each other. And we have some language for the anti-federalists saying states are stronger. We have some language saying the national government is stronger. Article 6 of the Constitution has this very famous supremacy clause that says the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States are the supreme laws of the land. And so if a state constitution comes into conflict with the national constitution, the supremacy clause says the national constitution wins. We've had a lot of debate over the past few months about ICE enforcement and sending federal officials into these cities. And the argument on the part of the federal government, I use national and federal government interchangeably, like I think most of us do today, but and with the argument on the part of the federal government is a supremacy clause. That because the federal government is supreme, the federal government has the ability to send these troops in. And so we see some practical examples of that supremacy clause. So the supremacy clause is a very strong pronouncement of national government power, which is then balanced by the 10th Amendment to the Constitution that says all powers that are not given to Congress nor denied to the states belong to the states or the people. And so that was a big nod to the anti-federalists. So when we read the Constitution, we have some language arguing for a strong national government, some language arguing for stronger state governments. Since you have those compromises and you have that conflicting language, the issue of federalism becomes very dynamic in that it's open to interpretation. And over the past 200 plus years, we have fought and disagreed about the interpretation of our system of federalism and which level of government should truly have most of the power. That's why federalism is very much of a dynamic concept and why it has changed so much over the past 200 years. So let's talk a bit about the evolution of federalism, where we started with federalism and where we are today with our system of this vertical separation of powers. So to start out with the first era of federalism, a lot of federalism scholars will refer to as dual federalism. And that starts from the founding of the nation, at least with the Constitution, and runs up to the beginning of the Civil War. So 1789 or so up to 1861. That era of dual federalism was really marked by different spheres of influence for national versus state governments. So national government had its sphere of influence and its duties and responsibilities. State governments had their own sphere of influence, and never the two shall overlap. They were separate and distinct from each other. Hence the reason why it's called dual federalism. Now you'll notice along the left side of the slide, you'll see the different eras of federalism chronologically. Then there's that white inset box on the right side. That box presents to you three different conceptual models of federalism: coordinate authority model, overlapping authority model, and inclusive authority model. Dual federalism falls within the coordinate authority model of federalism. It's coordinated authority because the two levels of government are independent of each other. They're both kind of doing their own things and not really overlapping with each other. Each level of government has their own autonomy. They're both autonomous sovereign governments. So you have national doing its thing, state governments doing their thing. Now, one caveat I will add to that is if you do go on and take the intergovernmental relations class, you will read a work by Morton Grodzins. I'll put his name in text chat. Morton Grodzins. And Morton Grodzins is one of those heavyweights in the field of federalism. Grodzins argues that we never had dual federalism. Grodzins argued that when you look at the policies and programs that were being implemented, even from the late 1700s until the Civil War, there really wasn't that much of a separation in that state and national governments really still kind of shared responsibilities. And whenever there was a national program, the state government had some type of a say in it. It had some role to play in it. And Grodzins and his student Elazar actually went and looked to try and find what they considered to be programs that only belonged to one or the other level of government. And all they could come up with were a handful of very small, insignificant programs. So Grodzins argues there never was dual federalism, that national and state governments always overlapped with each other. However, I think the consensus among scholars of federalism is that, yeah, maybe there was some overlap, but it was still a lot more separate in dual federalism than certainly the relationship is today. Now, in this era of dual federalism, you had the national government doing its thing, state government doing its thing. The duties of the national government were much smaller and more limited in scope than the duties of state governments. So if you had to draw the two circles to represent dual federalism in this period, you would draw the circle for the national government as being smaller than the circle for state governments. So state governments had a lot more responsibilities than the national government. Then, as we make our way through the 1840s and the 1850s, as we all know, the nation is dealing with those compromises that were made by the framers in terms of the institution of slavery. And we know that the nation is being torn apart over the institution of slavery. Slave states wanted slavery extended into the territory so that when new states were then admitted to the Union, they'd be admitted as slave states. Obviously, primarily northern states, free states, were fighting against that. So as you know, we had a series of compromises. We won't go through all of them, but we know we had a series of compromises in the 1840s and 1850s to try and stave off a civil war. When we get into the 1850s, southern states, these slave states, were very upset with Congress because the North was growing much quicker than the South. And so Congress was dominated, especially the House of Representatives, was dominated by representatives from northern states, representatives from free states. So southern states felt that a northern dominated Congress was passing laws that were certainly not in the best interests of the southern states. That was the argument of those southern states. So, in order to try and stop these laws coming out of Congress, the southern states started to engage in certain types of strategies. One strategy is a strategy known as interposition. Interposition occurs when the southern states would use their resources to try and slow down and stop the implementation of these laws coming out of Congress. So the laws are coming out of Congress, they'd be handed down to the southern states, and the southern states would just say, we're going to slow our roll in implementing it. We're going to use every resource we have at our disposal to not implement these laws. So it's called interposition. You can only slow down implementation for so long, and eventually it's going to have to get implemented. So they had to move on to a more stringent type of strategy, and that strategy they used was nullification. Nullification was when the southern states would just simply declare a law passed by Congress to be null and void. So they would just ignore it. It's not that we're going to slow down our implementation. We're just going to say that is null and void. That's an illegal law. And so we are just going to completely ignore it. When nullification didn't work, then they moved to their most extreme strategy, which of course was secession. And that's when we saw South Carolina and then followed by other southern states secede from the Union. As we talked about last week when we talked about Federalist number 39, the legal rationale that Southern states used was that logic in Federalist 39. If the states created the Union, the states can then decide to leave the Union, that they had legal standing to make their own decision whether or not they wanted to stay in the Union. Obviously, the Lincoln administration disagreed with that, and so we ended up with the Civil War. At the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, the idea that state governments were the primary sovereign entity above and beyond the national government, that idea was essentially dead. We had Reconstruction in the years after the Civil War, and the whole states' rights approach was pretty much out the window. So, what happened in the era after the Civil War is that we still had kind of this separation between national and state governments in terms of their powers, but the sphere of influence for the national government expanded greatly. It expanded greatly in terms of their authority over southern states in bringing them back into the Union and repatriating their members back into the Union through all the Reconstruction policies. Also, the national government expanded its power over things such as interstate commerce. So we had the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, which is no longer with us today. But the Interstate Commerce Commission was created to give the national government more tools in regulating the commerce that flowed between the states. That was a great expansion of national power. National government also decided to get involved in regulating workplace safety, get involved in regulating the safety and quality of food, the safety and quality of prescription medications, and so on and so on. So we see this great expansion in the size of the national government, and this is kind of in game theory what we refer to as a zero-sum game. And in a zero-sum game, there is a finite amount of power in the world. So if one party wants to expand its power, by definition, it will do so to the detriment of the other party. There's no new power out there. So you're just reallocating power and authority. So the national government gets bigger. By definition, state government ends up losing authority. So I think if you had to draw a diagram for competitive federalism from 1865 to 1933, I think it would look a lot like that figure you have for a coordinated authority model. Is just that the national sphere would be even bigger as compared to the state sphere. This era is called competitive federalism because, again, it's a zero-sum game theory, and so the national and state governments are competing against each other for power, authority, and duties. So that's our second era of federalism, competitive federalism. It still is in alignment with the coordinate authority model. So it's still that first model there in that inset box. Then we have the stock market crash in the late 1920s, and we have the advent of the Great Depression. Because of the Great Depression, we then get FDR elected to the White House. And when FDR takes over the presidency in 1933, we all know that he brings with him all of his New Deal programs. Those New Deal programs are all meant to try and help pull the country out of the throes of the Great Depression. All these programs that were being created had to be administered by some new agencies. And so FDR then created what were called the alphabet agencies. And you had this great proliferation in the size of the national bureaucracy, which again lends more power and authority to the national government. Now, in the first few years of the New Deal, the Supreme Court was very cautious about some of these New Deal programs. And there were a few cases that went to the Supreme Court where the Supreme Court found these actions of the FDR administration to be unconstitutional. They felt it was an unconstitutional overreach of national government power and taking too much power away from state governments. So a few of those programs were struck down initially. So then you had FDR enter into the strategy known as court packing. And at least it was a threat of what was called court packing. So essentially what FDR said is, Supreme Court, if you are not going to validate my programs as being constitutional, I will pack the court with my own nominees. So there's nowhere in the Constitution that says you need to have 9 Supreme Court justices. We do, but we can have more, we can have less. There's nothing constitutionally that requires 9. So FDR said, well, I'm going to pack the court and I'm going to increase the size of the court to 15. And so I will nominate six new Supreme Court justices to be then confirmed by the Senate to then join the Supreme Court. Well, that threat alone was enough to start getting Supreme Court justices to reconsider their position. Because that's the last thing in the world that they want would be have their power diluted by having six new members coming in who are all in alliance or hold their allegiance to the president. So one by one, new cases that came before the court ended up being declared constitutional. And that's how a lot of those New Deal programs really made their way through the court throughout the 1930s. But through this era of FDR, all continuing all the way into the 1960s, we have our third era of federalism that's usually referred to as cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism, sometimes known as fiscal federalism, in that era, the relationship between national and state governments was really dictated by money. It was dictated by federal grants and aid. So the federal government would give these grants and aid to state governments to pass on down to local governments in order to help pull them out of the throes of the Great Depression. That's the reason why some people call this the era of fiscal federalism. In this era of cooperative fiscal federalism, we now introduce our second model of federalism, which is the overlapping authority model, which is that middle diagram on your screen. And clearly, we have this Venn diagram where you have overlapping spheres of influence. So in the middle of your diagram, you've got functions and duties that are shared by national, state, as well as local governments. But then you have some duties that belong to just the national and state governments, some that belong to national and local governments, some belong to state and local governments, and then you also have some things that belong only to the national, only to the state, or only to the local. But you can see when you look at the overlap, by far, most of the functions overlap between different levels of government, hence the reason why it's the overlapping authority model. The relationship here is instead of being independent, they are now interdependent. They are dependent upon each other. And whenever you have multiple levels of government dependent upon each other and interacting like this, you're going to have a whole lot of bargaining. So instead of autonomy, the authority pattern is one of bargaining and negotiations. So that's this third era of federalism from 1933 up until the mid 1960s. Now, we know in November of 1963, President Kennedy was assassinated. After his assassination, Lyndon Johnson ascends to the presidency. Lyndon Johnson then wins a presidential term in his own right in the election of 1964, an election that really was not very close whatsoever, but he wins in 1964. Johnson, when he comes into the White House, brings with him a different approach to the balance of power between national, state, and local governments. For Johnson, he felt that most decisions should be made in Washington, D.C., that the national government was the supreme level of government. So it was the job of the national government to make these policy decisions. And then the national government could then use different types of tools to get state and local governments to come into compliance with achieving those national objectives. Lyndon Johnson was very well known for things such as the Great Society and the War on Poverty. What Johnson wanted to do is he wanted to expand civil rights protections, especially across the South. And so this is a period of time where we start having National Guard troops coming into Alabama and Mississippi to try and desegregate the schools. We have the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We get the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We get the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So one major push of the Johnson administration was to try and use national government power to expand civil rights to these states that had not yet expanded civil rights. Then he also wanted to try and declare a war on poverty, where he would reduce the income disparities and the wealth disparities between the wealthiest Americans and the poorest Americans. He saw that there are wealthiest Americans who had exponentially more money and resources than poorer Americans, and he wanted to try and reduce that gap, and that was his war on poverty. To accomplish his goals, he used a set of creative tools. And this is the reason why this era of federalism is called creative federalism. He used a series of creative tools. One creative tool that he used was what was called a categorical grant. So if you're the national government and you want to incentivize state and local governments to take actions to help accomplish national policy objectives, you'll use tools to do that. You can use the carrot approach, which is to give them money and say, here is money to help you carry out this program to accomplish this national goal. That's the carrot approach. Or you can use the stick approach. And the stick approach would be the use of something such as a mandate. So he used both categorical grants, the carrot approach, as well as mandates, the stick approach, in a creative manner to get state and local governments to come into alignment. Now, a categorical grant, and if some of you work at the local or state government level, you may work with categorical grants. Categorical grants are very specific grants of money, where the national government says, here is a limited amount of money that is given to a state or local government for the purpose of spending on this area, spending it this way. There are a lot of strings attached to categorical grants. There are a lot of reporting requirements attached because the national government wants to make sure that the recipients are spending the money the way in which the national government wants them to spend the money. So you have these very specific grant programs. Then you also have the use of mandates. These mandates are essentially orders where the federal government will come in and order a state or local government to take a certain type of action. And not to get too much in the weeds on this, because if you take that 535 class, we talk more about there. But one type of mandate that was frequently used is what's called a direct order mandate. And I will modify that. It's used whenever the national government is able to use it, meaning that if the national government has the constitutional ability to order a state or local government to do something, then they will use a direct order mandate. A direct order mandate says you must take this action under threat of civil or criminal penalty. So there are penalties if you don't do what we tell you to do. But a direct order like that is something that the national government can only use if they have the constitutional authority to do so. So, for instance, in terms of regulating commerce, if what Congress is telling a state government to do is covered under the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, they could issue a direct order mandate to get them to do it. Another type of mandate that the Johnson administration used a lot was a cross-cutting mandate. A cross-cutting mandate is an order that cuts across multiple policy areas. Now, I said one of Johnson's primary goals was to expand civil rights. So, anti-discrimination. Anti-discrimination policy is a great example of a cross-cutting mandate. You may not discriminate on the basis of race, whether it be in education, whether it be in employment, whether it be in elections and voting, whether it be in housing. You cannot discriminate, and it cuts across all those different policy areas. Hence the reason why it's called a cross-cutting type of mandate. The third type is what's called a crossover mandate. Let's see. Diego asks, who would be penalized if they do not follow direct orders? The entire department is directly in chain of doing a sub action, or it be the state itself. It depends on where the violation occurs in terms of who's not doing what they're supposed to do. Typically, it would be a fine or some type of penalty against the state if the state is primarily responsible for this program. If it's a local agency, it would be the local agency itself. It typically would not be an individual. It would be the organization, the agency itself.
Oof, penalizing an entire state?
Yeah,
That sounds tough.
yeah. So the national government has done that in the past, where they have fined states for not coming into compliance with national rules and regulations. And the national government will do that. States will then challenge that in the courts, obviously, and say that's unconstitutional. That's a violation of, the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and then that gets fought out in the courts. Oftentimes, you'll see fines that are levied against local agencies. So you think about something like a local education agency. If a local education agency is violating some type of civil rights legislation, some type of civil rights law, they not only would have to rectify that, but that agency can be fined for that violation. Sometimes you'll see those types of fines from state being handed down to local governments. I know that there are a lot of, not a lot, but there are some local school districts that are fined by the state if they are not in compliance with state requirements in terms of, filing certain types of reports in a timely manner, things such as that. Brown Act violations, it's possible that you could get fined for that. Typically, in a Brown Act violation, it's going to be more of a cure and correct, meaning that if you did something in closed session that you should have done in public session, you just have to go back and redo it in public session. So for those types of transparency violations, it's usually just cure and correct. But for other things, yes, it could be fines. We've also seen the courts issue a lot of fines against state and local governments as well. Whenever the courts do it, those fines are usually referred to as structural remedies. And a structural remedy is where the court will come in and say, local agency, you have to take this type of action. If you do not take this action by this date, then we are going to start levying a fine against you. A good example of that was in the state of Missouri, where there's a school district in the state of Missouri that the Missouri State Supreme Court decided they were not spending enough per pupil on an annual basis. There are huge disparities in the amount of money being spent per pupil between the low wealth and the high wealth districts. So it violated the provision in the state constitution for an equal system of education. So case went up to the state Supreme Court. State Supreme Court agreed with the plaintiffs and said, school district, you must raise your taxes in order to spend more per pupil. And for every day that you do not raise your taxes to spend more money per pupil, we will fine the school district. In that instance, again, not to get too digress too much, but in that instance, it was especially hard for that local school district because Missouri had a supermajority law for increasing taxes. And so if you needed to increase taxes, you had to get a two-thirds majority of the voters. Well, every time they went to the voters, they were getting 40, 45%. They were far away from getting 67% voter support. So they weren't even close, but the Supreme Court didn't care. They said, you're going to have to find some way to raise money so that you can spend more per pupil. Eventually, what that district ended up doing is they ended up consolidating with another district. And so by consolidating, they were able to then leverage the resources of the other district. But that district actually ended up going away because of those structural remedies. So fines are a real thing, and they can be intergovernmental fines. They can be fines from the judiciary being handed down to state and local governments, or from the national government handed down to state and local governments. We also see the national government fine state and local governments for environmental violations as well. So we've got these types of direct order mandates, criminal and civil penalties. We've got these cross-cutting mandates that cut across different policy areas. And then we also have the word in text chat that's misspelled, which is a crossover mandate. A crossover mandate is a third type of mandate whereby the national government will say, state and local governments, you must take a certain type of action in a policy area. And if you do not, we are going to take federal money away from you in another policy area, or at least a related policy area. So one good example of this was in the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration wanted to see every state have a 0.08 blood alcohol content level. And the blood alcohol content level is a standard that law enforcement uses to determine whether or not someone's engaged in driving under the influence. Some states had 0.10, some had 0.12, so it was all over the map. There's a whole patchwork of blood alcohol content levels. Clinton administration wanted a nationwide 0.08 blood alcohol content level. It couldn't use a direct order mandate because it didn't have the constitutional authority to order states to change their blood alcohol content level. Obviously, that's not in the Constitution. There was no such thing as a blood alcohol content level when the Constitution was written. So they didn't have the constitutional authority to order it. So instead, they used this crossover mandate. You must adopt the state law of a zero point zero 0.08 blood alcohol content level. And if you do not, we are going to take federal highway transportation funds away from you. It crosses over. Now, again, those are kind of related, drunk driving and highway funds, but it's we're saying we're going to take money away from you in transportation spending if you don't do what we want you to do over here in blood alcohol content policy. We saw a similar type of thing that the national government did when it wanted to adopt a nationwide 55 mile per hour speed limit. We had some states that had, 65 and 70 mile per hour speed limits. This was back in the 70s. Some had no speed limits in certain areas of their state. So the national government said, we want you to adopt a 55 mile per hour speed limit. And if you do not adopt it, we will take, again, transportation funds away from you. Some states lost hundreds of millions of dollars in transportation funds because they refused to adopt a 55 mile per hour speed limit. Pennsylvania is one example that just lost an immense amount of federal transportation money. But that's what's called a crossover mandate. Do what we want you to do over here, or we're going to take money away from you over here. Then there are what are called preemptive mandates, and especially what's called partially preemptive mandates. In a partial preemptive mandate, these are used primarily in environmental regulation. So, in a partially preemptive mandate, the national government will establish here is the national standard, the minimum standard for water quality, or here is the national minimum standard for air quality. State governments, whenever you pass your law must be at least as strict as the minimum national standard. You have to at least meet the national minimum standard. So you are preempted from having a law that is less strict, less stringent than the national standard. However, it's partially preemptive because you can have a stricter standard if you want. And here in California, we have air quality and water quality standards that are above the federal minimum standard. And we historically have been allowed to do that. The current administration doesn't like that very much. And so the current administration has at least threatened to take a variety of different federal transportation money away from California if it doesn't reduce its air quality and water quality standards down to the federal standard. And so the current administration kind of looks at that federal minimum standard as being a ceiling. In the past, it was more of a floor. But that's what's called a partially preemptive type of mandate, again, used primarily in environmental regulation. So those are just some different types of sticks, if you will, some different types of mandates that you can use to get state and local government to come into compliance. And those are the kind of creative techniques that we saw the Johnson administration use, hence the reason why his era of federalism is called creative federalism. Creative federalism highlights our third and final model of federalism, known as the inclusive authority model. In this one, obviously, your local governments are subsumed within the state, and your state government is subsumed within the national government. So, national government is preeminent. State and local governments are essentially agents of the national government. Their power is included within the power of the national government. State and local governments are then dependent upon the national government, is very much of a top-down, tall, hierarchical type of power structure. So that was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson only served one of his own terms in the White House in 1968 because America was embroiled in the Vietnam War. Uh, Johnson's popularity ratings were not very good. When he ran in the New Hampshire primary, he didn't do nearly as well in the New Hampshire primary as he thought he should do. And so he decided not to run for president. So he pulled out of the race for presidency. Richard Nixon for the Republicans won the election of 1968 in a very close election, but won the White House. And then when Nixon comes into the White House in 1969, he brings in with him a different approach to federalism that is diametrically opposed to Johnson's approach. Johnson believed in inclusive authority model, decisions made at the national level. Nixon believed that decisions were best made at the lowest level of government. So he would make the argument, who knows what's in the best interest of their citizens than the government that is located closely to those citizens. So decision making should be decentralized down to state and local governments. Nixon's approach to federalism was known as New Federalism. And that name is kind of stuck, even though it was decades ago. It's still called the era of new federalism. And Nixon's new federalism was predicated upon what he called these three D's of federalism, three words that all start with D. The first one I've already told you is decentralization. So we decentralize decision making. We allow state and local government to have a seat at the decision making table. We decentralize decision making out of Washington, D.C. The second D was devolution. It is one thing to decentralize decision making and allow state and local governments to participate in decision making. It's another thing to provide them with the resources to carry out those decisions. Devolution is devolving the authority and the resources down to the state and local level to allow them to have the resources to carry out the decisions that they are making. In the world of federalism, this whole idea of devolving resources is what's known as the principle of subsidiarity. And subsidiarity means providing the resources to subnational governments to allow them to carry out decisions. Then the third D of his three Ds of federalism is deregulation. Remove some of these national regulations that were imposed upon state and local governments, as well as regulations imposed upon private corporations, free up state and local governments and private corporations to kind of make their own decisions. So decentralization, devolution, and deregulation kind of take the Johnson approach to federalism and flip it upside down. For Nixon, the primary tool that he used to accomplish this was something called general revenue sharing. And this is his primary tool, general revenue sharing. In general revenue sharing, the national government would turn over a percentage of national income tax proceeds directly over to state and local governments to spend as those governments saw fit. So very few, if any, strings attached. Here's a percentage of the revenue we're generating at the national level. We're going to give it to you to spend however you want to spend it. It's a very hands-off, very decentralizing, devolving type of an approach. We'll kind of bypass the Ford and Carter administration, but the next administration that's really important for the evolution of federalism is the Reagan administration. So Reagan wins the election of 1980, unseating an incumbent president, Jimmy Carter, comes into the White House in 1981. When Reagan comes into the White House, he really believed very much in Nixon's new federalism. He agreed with it. He wanted to devolve and deregulate and decentralize. We saw a lot of deregulation during the Reagan era. Reagan, however, realized one thing. And the one thing that he realized is that general revenue sharing was not working. It wasn't working because the federal government did not have revenue to share. Every single year, beginning in 1969, all the way up through the 1980s, the federal government ran a deficit where it was spending more money than it was generating. And that deficit was becoming bigger and bigger with each passing year. So we didn't have any money to share. And so general revenue sharing was kind of a concept, but it wasn't actually being used. So Reagan in 1986 got away with general revenue, done away with general revenue sharing. It's not that he disagreed with general revenue sharing, but he got rid of it because it just wasn't effective. And he replaced general revenue sharing with another type of grant known as a block grant. Now remember, Johnson used categorical grants, very specific grants with a lot of strings attached. So he could, and the national government could control how that money was being spent. Reagan believed more in states' rights, believed more in state and local government autonomy. And so he wanted to take those categorical grants and then transform them into much broader grants known as block grants. With a block grant, the recipient who receives that grant, the state or local government, has a lot more flexibility in how to spend that money. They have to spend that money to help further the goals of a program or a policy, but how they do it is kind of up to them. So one example is from welfare reform in the 1990s and the temporary assistance to needy family grants or the TANF grants. That's an example of a more block grant whereby you have to spend the money to move people from welfare to work. However, how you specifically spend the money is up to you as long as it's moving people from welfare to work. So if you can demonstrate that you are reducing your welfare rolls, but you want to spend that money on childcare programs or job training programs or computer literacy programs, hey, that's completely up to you. We just want to make sure that you're getting the results that we want you to get. So it provides a lot more of that flexibility called a block grant. So that was Reagan's approach throughout the 1980s, carries on into George W. Bush's presidency, his one term in office. And then in the election of 1992, we know that Clinton unseats the incumbent president, President George W. Bush. And when Clinton comes into the White House in 1993, I think this is where we really start to begin truly our modern approach to federalism. And I like to refer to that modern approach to federalism as contextual federalism, whereby the relationship between the different levels of government will depend more on the issue than it does on ideology. Prior to this, if you had a Republican administration, like a Nixon or a Reagan administration, you would assume that the predilection would be towards state and local government power and for decentralization. If you had a Democratic administration, like a Johnson administration or like an FDR administration, you would assume that the predilection would be toward centralization and centralizing power at the national level. It was more ideological. Federalism was more ideological. Today, it's more defined by the issue itself, in that we have seen Democratic presidents that have at times decentralized with their policy approaches, while at other times centralizing, and the same exact thing that we have seen from Republican administrations. So this is not a party thing. It's no longer ideological. It really depends upon the issue. You think about the Obama administration. And so you would think a Democratic president would be more oriented around centralization in terms of federalism. But look how the Obama administration handled the issue of marijuana. The Obama administration was very nuanced in its approach to applying federal marijuana law and decided not to apply federal marijuana law and to allow state governments to have the flexibility to develop their own approaches. And as a result of that, we now have medical use of marijuana, recreational use of marijuana that is authorized under state law in a lot of our states. That came out of this more nuanced, hands-off approach from a Democratic president. Think about the presidency of not George H.W. I should have said George H.W. before. This is George W. Bush, and so the son. But the George W. Bush administration, where the Bush administration, for the most part, believed a lot in decentralization and devolution. However, when it came to education policy, they were champions of the No Child Left Behind Act that establishes national standards that state and local governments must adhere to. And you would have to have 100% of all the subgroups of your student population scoring proficient by a certain deadline, or else you are going to end up losing federal education funds. That is a very centralizing approach to education policy by a president that, in other respects, was much more decentralizing. And you also had things like the Real ID Act. And the Real ID Act that the national government prescribes that there will be certain types of features that need to be included on state ID cards in order for those state IDs to qualify for federal air travel. That Real ID Act is something that we are still, it took us 20 years before we finally actually implemented the elements of that Real ID Act. So again, I think it's a much more contextual issue-based type of decision in terms of which level of government has the power and has the authority. The upshot of all this and the implication of all this, the big so what question is this means that it's become more difficult for us to study federalism because federalism is now contextual. We have to understand the specific issue that's at play to understand what the desired level of government, which desired level of government should have the power. It's not just saying it's Democrat or Republican, ideological. Now it's very much issue based. So it's much more difficult for us to predict what administrations are going to do in terms of their approach to federalism. This has impact on us as public administrators. Both separation of powers as well as federalism will impact the work that we do. One of the major impacts that we face from separation of powers and federalism is what's referred to in the literature as the many masters approach, in that we as public administrators are held accountable to legislative bodies. Legislative bodies enable our organizations. They provide us with our appropriations. They have the primary oversight function over what we do as administrators. Our organizations we work in are located within the executive branch, and so we have direct oversight from the chief executive as well as executive level officials. And through structural remedies and consent decrees and judicial review, we also are, in essence, overseen as well from a constitutional perspective by the judiciary. So that separation of powers means we've got all these different people and all these different organizations we're accountable to. Federalism means that we have the same type of accountability only running vertically. And so if you're at the local government level, then you're accountable to state laws and regulations and agencies. You're also accountable to the national government. So we have all these different masters we serve horizontally as well as vertically. When you have all these different organizations that you are being held accountable to, you have a lot of conflicting direction. So you have the legislature trying to push you in one direction, the executive pushing you into another direction. You have the national government with its policy priorities and the state government with its policy priorities, and sometimes those do not line up very well. Your local government in California, the state government approach is probably going to look a lot different than the current national government approach. So we deal with a lot of these conflicting directions. Also, it creates this environment of complexity where we form these networks of cooperation and competition. It is very seldom for us today to have one singular agency responsible for all aspects of a program. Typically, we have what we call governing networks. So we will form these networks with other public agencies, with nonprofit organizations, sometimes with corporations in the private sector. We will form these networks that will then help us better implement these policies, programs, and laws. And those networks end up being very complex and difficult for us to manage. What this all creates is what John Gauss calls our ecology of public administration. And John Gauss, in his theory of the ecology of public administration, argues that to understand why an organization behaves the way in which it behaves, we have to first understand its surrounding environment. So, just like with a house plant, to understand why that house plant is growing, we have to know how much water it gets, how much fertilizer it gets, how much sunlight it gets. Some people say how much the plant gets talked to. I don't know about that one, but you have to know all these things in the environment of the plant to understand why the plant is reacting the way in which it does. Same type of thing with public organizations. We have to understand the environment to understand the public organization. That means that studying public organizations today is an extremely complex endeavor. And that complexity comes primarily from our system of American government. We'll talk a lot more about complexity next week when we really get into a discussion of the study of public administration and kind of what makes public environments different than private environments. So we'll talk a lot more about that next week. But it really is our system of American government that creates for us this very complex, this very political type of environment that we have to understand in order to understand our public organization. So it does have a very big impact on us as public administrators, as well as on our study of the field of public administration. Questions on any of the rest of this information? This now kind of wraps up this introduction into American government. Any questions on any of this information?
No.
Okay, everyone good? All right. Then let's spend a few minutes before our break looking at the Constitution. Now, you'll never have another opportunity in the program. On pretty firm ground saying this. You'll never have another opportunity in the program to look at the Constitution. The Constitution is important to us as public administrators because, as I had mentioned to you before, this idea of qualified good faith immunity that continues to be reviewed by the courts, and the courts are really starting to getting a lot of cases on qualified good faith immunity, and they're really trying to set up these guardrails in terms of when the immunity exists and when the immunity does not exist. But traditionally, to have this type of immunity from prosecution, we need to be acting within the course of our duties of our job, and we need to not be violating the constitutional freedoms and liberties and rights of people we come into contact with. So, as public administrators, it's important that we understand what these freedoms and liberties and rights are in the Constitution. Now, just because of the limited scope of an introductory class like this, we look at the national constitution. We don't spend a lot of time talking about the California state constitution. But just to kind of throw a couple of facts out there with the California state constitution, we are on our second constitution here in the state of California. Our first constitution was ratified before California became part of the Union. So once California became part of the Union, it obviously needed another constitution, a new constitution, and that's the constitution that we got in the 1870s. Our constitution here in the state of California is, if not the lengthiest, one of the lengthiest constitutions in the entire world. We have over 35 articles in our state constitution. Compare that to the national constitution that only has 7 articles. The national constitution only has 27 amendments. The California Constitution has been amended over 480 times. So it's much more detailed, much lengthier than what we see at the national level. But it's important for us to have a working knowledge of what not what just what the state constitution says, but also what the national constitution says. You could have an entire class on the California State Constitution, and if you go to law school, you will have an entire class probably on the California State Constitution. But because of our limited scope, we're going to look at the federal Constitution and do it as quickly as we can, because I assume you've already read the Constitution. You've probably looked at the Constitution in previous courses. Hopefully, you already have a working knowledge of the Constitution. It's obviously the hope that every American has a working knowledge of the Constitution. It's a hope that every politician, every elected official also has a working knowledge of the Constitution. And I don't think that that is really the reality, unfortunately. So, Article 1 of the Constitution. The Constitution is a very well organized document. It consists of 7 different articles. The first article looks at Congress. As we know from our discussion last week, Congress was a compromise. And we ended up getting this bicameral Congress, this House of Representatives, this U.S. Senate as a compromise between the large and small states. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution establishes this bicameral legislature. Then Article 1, Section 2 gets into the details about the House of Representatives. So specific details such as who qualifies to serve in the House of Representatives. If you want to serve in the House of Representatives, you have to be at least 25 years old. You have to have been a citizen for at least 7 years, and you need to be an inhabitant of the state in which you are chosen. So those are the basic requirements to be in the U.S. House of Representatives. We also know in Article 1, Section 2, that we lay out things such as the positions within the House of Representatives. There is one constitutional position, and that is Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is then second in line to the president after the vice president. All other offices within the House of Representatives are chosen by the House of Representatives. So all the whips and minorities, the minority leaders, those are all chosen by the parties within the House of Representatives. Whenever vacancies occur, those vacancies then can be filled by the chief executive in that state, being obviously the governor. The 3/5 compromise, thankfully, is out of the Constitution. So that's why you see that paragraph in brackets. That's no longer part of the Constitution. Section 3 then gets into the U.S. Senate. The U.S., and we should mention in the House, we all know members of the House serve 2-year terms. And that was done intentionally by the framers because that's a House that's supposed to be the closest to the people. They're popularly elected and they only serve 2-year terms, so they can be held accountable. Section 3, we talk about the Senate. The Senate is the upper house. As we know, members of the Senate serve longer terms. They serve 6-year terms. We also know under the original Constitution that members of the Senate were not popularly elected. They were selected by state legislatures. Again, that's very much of a nod to the Anti-Federalists and states' rights. In order to be a member of the Senate, you have to be a little bit older. You have to be at least 30 years old. You have to be a citizen for 9 years and be an inhabitant of the state in which you are being chosen. We also know in the Senate, the leader of the Senate constitutionally is the Vice President of the United States. However, the Vice President of the United States can only vote in the case of a tie. We have seen Vice President Vance already exercise that right a couple of times in the Senate, breaking ties. We saw Vice President Harris during the Biden administration break, I think it was something like 34 or 35 ties in her time as vice president. So much so that she got an award from Chuck Schumer for the vice president that had broken the most ties in the history of the Senate. Also in the Senate, we have a constitutional officer that is the president pro tem of the Senate. The president pro tem of the Senate is typically the longest serving member from the majority party. So, AKA Chuck Grassley. Whereas the House has the ability to pass articles of impeachment, and they can do that through a simple majority vote, the Senate's job is to hold an impeachment trial. We saw President Clinton be impeached and tried in the Senate. We saw President Trump in his first term be impeached twice and tried twice in the Senate. The only other president to be impeached was Andrew Johnson back in the 1860s. He was not only impeached, but he survived being removed by the Senate by absolutely one vote. And that was one vote that changed at the last second. And it wasn't a vote in favor of Andrew Johnson. It was more a vote being concerned about removing a president. So impeachments have been relatively rare, but they're becoming much more frequent over the past few decades. If you watch any of those impeachment trials, you know that it's a really an interesting process whereby the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court presides over that impeachment trial. The House will then send impeachment trial managers who will come over and they will then present the case against the president. Then the president's defense lawyers will then present their defense. All senators, before the trial begins, will have to go and sign an oath. And there is a book in the well of the Senate, and one by one, each senator has to come down and physically sign their name in the book, committing to the oath that, yes, they will be impartial jurors in the impeachment trial. Not just presidents who have been impeached in the past, but members of the judiciary. We've all had frequent, or not frequent, we have more frequent instances of members of the judiciary actually being impeached. So that's kind of the way in which that impeachment trial works there in the Senate. We know that the Senate was created to be a much more egalitarian body. And the way in which the Senate operates is it's based much more on equal power on the part of senators. So if you are a brand new freshman senator, you ostensibly have the same power to speak on the floor of the Senate as someone who's been in the Senate for 30 years. The House is different. The House is a very power-based structure. So if you are a brand new member of the House, you are what's referred to as a backbencher, which means that you're probably not going to get a whole lot of airtime on C-SPAN. You're probably not going to get on any plum committee assignments. It really is a very structured type of power system in the House of Representatives. And then we can talk all day about differences between the House and Senate. We don't have time to do that, so we won't. Article 1, Section 4 is an important one that's being talked about a lot today, and this is the Elections Clause. The time, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. This gives the state legislature the ability to decide how members of Congress will be elected. However, after that semicolon, you have, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. So Congress does have the ability to override some of these regulations and some of this legislation that comes out of the state, but obviously that's something that can only be done by Congress. It's not something constitutionally that can be done by the executive branch. So whenever we hear talk about the executive branch nationalizing the midterm elections, that's something that is not within the bounds of the Constitution for the executive branch. And you'll hear more and more about that. There's a lot more here, but I know we're really short on time. So let's skip down to Article 1, Section 7. Important thing about Article 1, Section 7 is that you have your revenue raising clause here, that any bill that raises revenue, in other words, increases taxes, must start in the House of Representatives, because that is the House that is closer to the people. Also, we lay out here the process by which a bill becomes a law. There's a really great skit on Saturday Night Live a few years ago that really was it was a skit that took off on the whole Schoolhouse Rock. I don't know if you're probably too young to remember that. Maybe you've seen it, where there's a whole how a bill becomes a law. And the bill and it comes down the steps of Congress, and it's a cartoon that then talks about how it becomes a law. Uh, the Saturday Night Live skit was about an executive order. And it was really, if you can Google it on or look it up on YouTube, and it's really funny because it really shows the difference between executive orders versus laws. A lot of legislation today is being, not legislation, a lot of the policies now are coming out of executive orders, which kind of bypasses this entire legislative process. But the legislative process spelled out in Article 1, Section 7 is that a bill must pass the House and the Senate in identical version before it can go to the president for the president's signature. That means that what has to happen is we have to have these conference committees that will hammer out differences between the House and the Senate versions of the bills. You've seen this happening in terms of the appropriation bills that we are still struggling to try and get through. We got through most of them, but carved out Department of Homeland Security so that Democrats and Republicans can have more discussions about DHS and ICE. Department of Homeland Security only has a temporary authorization. And so if we don't have an appropriation bill passed for the Department of Homeland Security by, was it the end of next week, I guess it would be, or close thereof, then they no longer have the legal authority to spend any money. So yeah, I think it's February 14th or 15th. And so that means they're not going to be able to spend money. So if they have money left over from last year, they might be able to spend that. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with DHS. But those appropriation bills that make up the budget, those also need to be passed in identical fashion by the House and the Senate. That's one of the reasons why it's very difficult for us to get budgets done on time. Article 1, Section 8, we already talked about the enumerated powers of Congress. We are listing the powers of Congress. The assumption then is if a power is not listed, then it is something that does not belong to the national government. One of the really important parts here is this to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. This is the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. It is important because when the national government has tried to expand its power over states, it typically does that through the Commerce Clause. So if Congress can show that the mandate that they are handing down to a state government is directly connected to interstate commerce, then the court will allow them to do it because it's within their enumerated power of regulating interstate commerce. Then at the bottom of Article 1, Section 8, let's scroll on down there, we have this very famous, we talked about before, elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, to make all laws which should be necessary and proper. So anything Congress needs to do to carry out its enumerated powers, it essentially is allowed to do it under necessary and proper clause. So the Commerce Clause and the necessary and proper clause taken together are the two main bases on which Congress has used in order to expand its powers in our system of American federalism. Article 1, Section 9 lays out the limitations on what Congress cannot do. Article 1, Section 10 lays out limitations on what state governments cannot do. So Article 1, Section 8 is what Congress can do. Article 1, Section 9 is what Congress cannot do. Then Article 2 looks at the presidency and lays out the powers and duties of the president. In order to be president, you have to be at least 35 years old and you must be a natural born citizen. So you must be born in the United States. There are provisions in here in terms of the president serving as the commander in chief. This was important for the framers to make sure that we had a civilian in charge of the military. So we always have this civilian who's in charge of the military. The president is also the chief diplomat and chief of state, and the presidents enter into treaties that are then ratified by the U.S. Senate. And I won't go into it, but there's an interesting story about George Washington and just how angry he was with the Senate when they wouldn't ratify one of his treaties. So angry that he swore he would never go back and visit the Senate again, and he never did. The president also has the ability to appoint officers That's his or their role as chief executive of the executive branch. They also have the power to recommend legislation to Congress. That makes the president the chief legislator. And oftentimes, Congress will consider legislation that's recommended to them by the president. Presidents take an oath of office, and that is actually word for word written here in Article 2. In the Obama administration, his inauguration, Chief Justice Roberts screwed up the oath, screwed it up so badly that he then insisted on later on that day meeting with President Obama in the Oval Office and re-administering the oath, because the oath is actually word for word listed in the Constitution. We then also know that presidents and other civil officers can be removed from office due to impeachment for conviction of treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors. And so the question is always, and has been in the in the Senate for quite a while, is that if a president or another executive official is found guilty on this impeachment charge, and they are then removed from office, are they then allowed to run for office again? Because the way in which the Constitution is written, it said that they would be removed from office, comma, and disqualified from holding future federal office. The question is always, because of that comma, does it mean that those two phrases always go together? That if a president's removed, they are no longer able to serve in any federal office? Or are those severable? Can we separate removal from office from serving in a future office? I only bring that up because the answer is we don't know. Because at certain points in time, the Senate parliamentarian has said they go together, you can't separate them. Other Senate parliamentarians have said they are severable. We don't really have a good answer to that. And that was a major question that a lot of people are asking in the second Trump impeachment trial during his first term in office. Article 3 looks at the Supreme Court. And we oftentimes like to say it's the judicial branch. It's really the Supreme Court. That's the only court that's created in Article 3 of the Constitution. All courts inferior to the Supreme Court were created by Congress in the Judiciary Act. So all of our circuit courts of appeal and our federal district trial courts, those are created by Congress. There are no qualifications to serve on the U.S. Supreme Court. Anybody can serve on the U.S. Supreme Court as long as you are nominated and confirmed by the Senate. There's no number of Supreme Court justices we have to have. Not a whole lot of detail in Article 3. Article 3 does spell out the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. You have original and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction allows a case to go directly to the Supreme Court. Appellate jurisdiction means the case has to work its way through the courts before it can make its way up to the Supreme Court. 99.99999% of all cases get to the Supreme Court via appellate jurisdiction. However, here's the other caveat. The Supreme Court has become very fond of using what's called the shadow docket. And so presidents can make emergency appeals directly to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court can decide whether or not they want to hear those emergency appeals. Those emergency appeals bypass the normal conference process that the Supreme Court uses to select what cases it's going to hear in a Supreme Court term. The Trump administration has been very fond of using emergency appeals, and the Supreme Court has been very fond of accepting those emergency appeals. Article number 4 of the Constitution gives us the full faith and credit clause that states must respect the laws of other states. Also gives us this provision about states. New states must be admitted by Congress. Congress has the power to decide new states. So whenever we talk about splitting up California, that's an interesting discussion to have, but it would have to be approved by Congress. Also in Section 4, the Constitution guarantees to the states a Republican form of government, meaning that we elect our officials. And so every state must allow for the election of their representatives. Article 5 of the Constitution tells us how we amend the Constitution. There are 4 different ways to amend the Constitution. The way that we almost always use is amendments proposed by 2/3 of the House and the Senate and then ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures. There's only one amendment that was ratified in a different way, and that was the 21st Amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment to the Constitution repealed the 18th Amendment. It repealed prohibition. That one was ratified by three-quarters of state constitutional conventions. And the reason for that is state constitutional conventions at that time were seen as being a quicker, more direct way of doing it than waiting for the state legislature. People wanted to get their alcohol back as quickly as possible. And so the 21st Amendment followed that path. But every other amendment has been ratified by three-quarters of state legislatures. Article 6 then gives us this supremacy clause that we had talked about before, that the Constitution and laws of the United States and all treaties made and which shall be made shall be the supreme law of the land. Very much something the Federalists wanted in the Constitution. One of the major reasons why the Anti-Federalists pushed so hard to get the 10th Amendment to the Constitution to try and balance against this supremacy clause. Article 7 then talks about how the Constitution gets ratified. We know that it got ratified out of 9 out of 13 states ratified it. It then went into effect. What is really important for us as public administrators is, again, to understand the freedoms that are provided for citizens in the Bill of Rights. You're probably familiar with the amendments to the Constitution, at least the first 10, the Bill of Rights. First Amendment, speech, press, assembly, religion. We know that there can be limitations, however, placed upon some of these freedoms. Religion is broken into two. It's the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause is essentially unfettered in that you are allowed to believe anything, any religion you want to believe. There's no national religion that you have to believe. However, the free exercise of religion can be limited if that free exercise intrudes upon public safety. Likewise, freedom of speech can be limited if it intrudes upon public safety. If you yell fire in a crowded theater, that's an exception to freedom of speech. Freedom of the press. Usually when there are limitations on freedom of the press, it has to do with things such as libel laws or it has to do with national security. We don't have time to go into it, but you may be familiar with the Pentagon Papers case. Pentagon Papers case was a good example of what we call prior restraint. Prior restraint is when the national government tries to, or a government tries to stop the publication of something before it is published. A lot of nations have prior restraint. We, in our country, do not really have prior restraint because of this freedom of the press, unless there is a direct impact upon national security. Assembly is a really interesting one now because we have all these demonstrations going on in a lot of our cities. That is also something that can be limited, and we have seen how governments have limited the right to peaceably assemble. In LA, we see the LAPD declare an unlawful assembly. Once they declare an unlawful assembly, if the people who have assembled do not leave, that's when they are then subject to possible arrest. Second Amendment is your right to bear arms. We argue about this all the time as a society. We are not going to get into the merits of that here in this class. One thing I will point out to you, though, is we oftentimes struggle with saying we don't know how to interpret what the framers meant by what they wrote. One of the ways to know what the framers meant is to read some of their other writings like the Federalist Papers. And this whole idea of having a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That first clause of a well-regulated militia, that is something that Alexander Hamilton wrote pretty extensively about, especially in Federalist Paper number 29. So if this is something that's of interest to you, take a look at Federalist number 29, and you'll see that he has some real specific ideas about what well-regulated means and how we should make sure our militias are well-regulated. So it really wasn't a throwaway phrase at all for Alexander Hamilton. Amendment number 3 is no quartering of soldiers. That's part of your privacy protections. Amendment number 4, no unreasonable search and seizures. Again, this is one that's been in the news recently. Department of Homeland Security issued a directive to its members saying that they could go into property based upon an administrative search warrant. In the past, it's always had to be a judicial search warrant. A judicial search warrant is a search warrant that is signed by a member of the judiciary, by a judge. An administrative search warrant is one that is signed by an administrator, could be within the Department of Homeland Security. I'm sure that this directive is being challenged in the courts as we speak. Historically and traditionally, you've had to have a judge review and approve that search warrant because that is your checks and balances. That's the way in which the judiciary can review what the executive branch is doing. But we'll keep an eye on that and see what happens with that directive. Fifth Amendment are some of your criminal justice protections. You can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself. You cannot be tried for the same crime twice. That's your protection against double jeopardy. The double jeopardy protection is something that raises a good point about what's called incorporation. If you've taken any courses in federalism before or constitutional law, you're familiar with this term incorporation. Incorporation occurs when the courts extend these freedoms to include prohibitions against state and local government actions as well. In the early days of the Supreme Court viewed these freedoms in the Bill of Rights as only applying to national government action. The process of incorporation is extending those protections to include protections against state and local governments as well. Very famous case in the 1930s of Palco versus Connecticut. Palco was an individual who was tried by the state of Connecticut on first-degree murder charges. The jury came back guilty on second-degree murder. State of Connecticut was not happy with that, so they retried Palco to try and get a first-degree murder case to stick. It was the exact same case, the exact same facts, so he was tried twice for the same crime. The jury came back first-degree murder. The state of Connecticut was happy. Obviously, Palco was not. Palco took his case all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "We're sorry, Mr. Palco, but your double jeopardy protections are only protections against actions by the national government. This was done to you by a state." It wasn't until 30 years later, in a case in 1968 called Benton versus Maryland, that the Supreme Court finally incorporated your double jeopardy protections to include protections against state and local governments as well. Way too late to help Mr. Palco, but it just kind of shows you how gradual the incorporation of these rights has been in terms of court interpretations. And no, we're not talking about every single aspect of these amendments, just kind of the highlights. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution gives you your right to an impartial jury trial, gives you your right to counsel. Throughout the 1960s, we had a series of Supreme Court cases that expanded and interpreted these rights. One of those was Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda versus Arizona is what gives us our Miranda rights. So whenever a law enforcement official Mirandizes someone, they're reading them their Miranda rights, telling them that anything they say can and be used against them in a court of law. They have the right to counsel. If they cannot afford counsel, one will be appointed to them. That's their Sixth Amendment rights. You cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. That's also one in the Fifth Amendment that we didn't talk about. Seventh Amendment is a jury trial in civil cases worth more than $20. $20 meant more then than it does now. Eighth Amendment, no excessive fines, no cruel and unusual punishment. This is another one that has never been fully incorporated. That's why you have states that have the death penalty, because they are allowed to do that because the courts have not deemed this to be a cruel and unusual punishment. The fraud trial for President Trump, he received a very hefty fine. He then challenged that and appealed that fine as being excessive. And the appeals court agreed with him and said that, I think it was like $450 million or something like that, that was an excessive fine and violated his Eighth Amendment rights. The Ninth Amendment to the Constitution says that even though we're enumerating rights to the national government here in the Constitution, that's not to be construed to deny others retained by the people. Again, a nod to the Anti-Federalists. And as we know, the 10th Amendment, a big nod to the Anti-Federalists. The Reserve Powers Amendment, that if it's a power not given in the Constitution, then it is not prohibited to states, then it is reserved to the states or to the people. So that was meant to try and close some of these holes in the enumerated powers in Article 1, Section 8. So most of these rights and freedoms that we are concerned with trying to maintain, we find those primarily through the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. The 11th Amendment limits the judicial power of the federal government. The 12th Amendment eliminates a system where the person who comes in second place becomes vice president. This is an amendment that Jefferson wanted very badly because of how much he detested Aaron Burr, his vice president, and was successful in getting that proposed and then ratified by the states. 13th Amendment outlaws slavery. 14th Amendment is your equal protection amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. This is, again, birthright citizenship. And this is something that we are seeing discussed now in terms of the current administration's attempt to try and interpret it differently than the way in which it's been interpreted in the past by the courts. The 15th Amendment is providing the right to vote, and it cannot be denied based upon race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So those are your Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15. 16th Amendment is the federal income tax. Historically, under the original Constitution, taxes had to be apportioned according to population, so that you had to look at state population, determining how much each state would have to pay. This allows for the imposition of a direct income tax directly on individual incomes. 17th Amendment provides us with the direct election of U.S. senators. 18th Amendment is prohibition. 19th Amendment is women suffrage. The 20th Amendment changes the terms of the president and Congress so that we move their terms up to January instead of starting all the way down back in March. 21st Amendment undoes prohibition and repeals the 18th Amendment. 22nd Amendment gives us our term limits on the president. The presidents can only serve 2 terms in office. Discussion about this again, in that there's been some discussion in the White House about, does this preclude President Trump from serving a 3rd term? The wording in the 22nd Amendment is no person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice. So the term used is elected. Ostensibly, the only way to become president, unless the president dies and the vice president, is to be elected. And so you would think that would probably preclude a 3rd term. 23rd Amendment gives 3 electoral votes to the District of Columbia. The 24th Amendment outlaws poll taxes that were being used in southern states to discriminate and to try and erode people's voting abilities. 25th Amendment spells out the process by which the vice president can become president if the president is incapable of carrying out their duties. So in the 25th Amendment, the vice president, with a majority of the members of the cabinet, can declare a president incapacitated. They would deliver that declaration to the Congress, and then the vice president would take over the role of the president. When the president felt that they were ready to reclaim the presidency, they would file that with Congress, and then Congress would have to decide, does the vice president remain president, or does the president get to resume their duties? Typically, this 25th Amendment is used for medical procedures. And so if you have a president that's getting a colonoscopy like Joe Biden did, then he would temporarily turn over the powers to the vice president, but it would be temporary. 26th Amendment to the Constitution gives the right to vote to 18, 19, and 20-year-olds. And then the final amendment, the 27th Amendment, from a process perspective, is the most interesting. Originally authored by James Madison, as you can see, back in 1789, it was supposed to be the Second Amendment to the Constitution, but failed to be ratified by enough states to become part of the Constitution. It then sat dormant until in the 1970s, a student in the state of Texas wrote a term paper arguing that it was still a viable amendment. He argued it was still a viable amendment because there was no sunset provision. Today, when amendments are proposed, they have a sunset provision, like the Equal Rights Amendment, that says if it is not ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures within 7 years, then it is null and void. Back then, we didn't have those sunset provisions. And so he argued it was still a valid amendment. His professor disagreed with him. I think he got a C minus or something on the paper. Undeterred, he then went out there and started a nationwide movement to get the remaining states to ratify the amendment. ended up getting ratified by the remaining states on May 7th, 1992. So what should have been the Second Amendment to the Constitution becomes the 27th Amendment to the Constitution over 200 years after it was originally proposed. No law varying the compensation for the services of senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. If you want to get your pay raise, you got to stand for re-election first. So 200 years later, it is finally added to the Constitution. We have only amended the Constitution 27 times, 10 of those all at once in the Bill of Rights. So it is very rare for us to amend the federal Constitution because the process is a very daunting process. However, here in the state of California, it's much easier because we have initiatives. And so if the public wants to put a constitutional amendment on the ballot, they can do that if they get enough signatures on a petition. That's why we have amended the California Constitution over 480 times. So I know this was a really quick overview of the Constitution, but it's really the only time you'll have the opportunity to do this in the entire MPA program. So I kind of wanted to seize that opportunity so that you can at least refresh your memory about what's in the Constitution. So as public administrators, as we do our jobs and as we interface with citizens, we at least have a working knowledge of what types of freedoms and rights we need to protect as we interface with those citizens. I know I went way past where we usually go for a break, but I really wanted to get through all this American government and Constitution information before our break. So to compensate for that, we'll do a break until 6 o'clock. I'll give you an extra 5 minutes on the break tonight instead of our 10-minute break. So let's take a break until 6 o'clock. We'll come back at 6 o'clock and then we'll shift our attention to ethics of public service. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why it is sometimes to hold people ethically adherent in the public service and some of the major differences between ethical expectations in the public sector as compared to those in the private sector. So take a break, come on back at 6 o'clock, and we'll talk ethics and accountability. Welcome back. It's 6 o'clock. So let's go ahead and talk about accountability and ethics. I think I'd already mentioned to you that our accrediting body, NASPA, allows programs to take two approaches to ethics. They can either have a standalone required course in ethics, or they can sprinkle ethics across the curriculum. We obviously chose the latter. So you get a little bit of taste of ethics and accountability here as a foundational type of concept in 500. And then as you move through your core curriculum, you'll cover it in the different perspectives that you're covering those courses. So when you take public budgeting and finance, you'll talk about financial accountability. When you talk about human resource management in 577, you'll talk about the ethical implications of dealing with human beings and so on and so on. So our only purpose tonight, about 45 minutes, is to provide you with an introduction into accountability and ethics in the public sector and why it is somewhat different in the public sector as compared to the private sector. At the very basic level, accountability speaks to a relationship between people and things. The people we are interested in are going to be the administrators. The things we're interested in will be public resources, whether it be money, facilities, and the like. It is important for us to have accountability measures in the public sector because it's really the foundation of the bureaucracy. When you think about the linkage between administrators and voters, there is very little direct linkage. We as administrators are hired into our positions based upon merit principles. So we're hired based upon our knowledge, skills, and abilities. We are not voted into office. So therefore, we don't really have much of a connective tissue with the voters, with the exception of elected officials. Elected officials are directly elected by the people. They then oversee the actions of administrators. And so it really is those elected officials that serve as that conduit between the administrators and members of the public in terms of accountability. The problem is a lot of elected officials don't want to engage in accountability because when they engage in accountability, there are always negative connotations associated with accountability. Whenever you hold someone accountable for their actions, it oftentimes means uncovering or discovering problems. When you're an elected official and you're associated with some type of an ethical problem, that's going to have an impact on your reelection prospects. As David Mayhew told us back in 1974, the primary goal of elected officials is to get reelected. So elected officials oftentimes don't want to serve their role as the conduit between administrators and voters. So they end up keeping their distance when it comes to accountability. That is unfortunate because it really is this oversight responsibility of elected officials and elected bodies that is meant to hold administrators accountable for their actions. So, as we've said many times over the past couple of weeks, that as administrators, our actions are overseen by elected officials, by policymakers. That's the oversight process. However, the oversight process is really fraught with problems. One of the major problems with elected officials being able to oversee the actions of administrators is the problem of the principal agent relationship. So, in the principal agent relationship, the elected official is the principal, and the administrator, the agency, is the agent. Normally, it's the principal that oversees the actions of the agent. So, in that type of relationship, you would think that the principal would have more information than the agent. The principal would have adequate information to hold the agent accountable for their actions. The problem in this principal agent relationship is that there is information asymmetry, in that it's the agency and the administrators that actually have more information than the overseers, than the principals. The reason for that is who knows what is going on in the organization on a daily basis better than those who are located in the organization. Those administrators are there on a daily basis. The elected officials, the overseers, are going to be much more remote from those daily operations. So, because of that information asymmetry, it suggests to us a moral dilemma for these administrators, or what's known in the principal agent relationship as a moral hazard. The moral hazard for administrators is the more information they provide to the elected officials, the more capable elected officials are to scrutinize the administrator's actions and to hold the administrators accountable. So there's kind of a disincentive for administrators to provide information to the elected officials because it'll just make the administrators' jobs a little bit more difficult. However, as we'll see a little bit later on when we talk about the ASPA Code of Ethics, principle number 5 in the ASPA Code of Ethics calls for administrators to fully inform and advise elected officials. So ethically, we are supposed to provide that information, even though there is a disincentive for us to do so. That presents this moral hazard. We know we should, but we're incentivized not to. When the information is not shared from administrator to the elected officials then lack the information they need to properly conduct oversight, even if they were motivated to do so. So that's one of the major problems with the principal agent relationship. Second problem with being able to conduct oversight is the prevalence of executive privilege. So oftentimes, especially at the federal level of government, whenever an administrator is called in to testify before Congress, if the White House doesn't want the administrator to share the information with Congress, the White House, the president, can claim executive privilege. Executive privilege is an Article 2 privilege of the president, where the Constitution says that presidents can not only appoint officials, but they can seek opinions from executive officials. So, since an Article 2 power of the president is to seek opinions of executive officials, they can then claim that any conversations they have with that administrator, that is privileged information, and then shield it from Congress getting a hold of that information. We have seen a lot of executive privilege used in recent administrations, and it has really hamstrung the oversight process. But oversight is important because we need to have that external oversight in order to make sure that administrators are acting ethically. But at the same time, we need to balance that external oversight with the freedom and flexibility so that administrators are freed up to make difficult and creative types of decisions. Not only do we want to make sure that they are doing the job as they're supposed to be doing it, but we also want to make sure that they're doing the job well. Too much accountability, too many ethical rules and regulations will inhibit bold action on the part of administrators and will also limit our ability to attract the best and brightest into the public service. So, as you'll see throughout our entire discussion tonight, ethical adherence is all about finding that balance, the balance between external ethical controls and the internal training and characteristics of the administrators themselves. And we can't have too many external controls. We have to have just the right balance so those administrators will be freed up to make the difficult decisions to actually do their jobs well. So, how has the field of public administration viewed accountability? The field of public administration has gone through some different eras in terms of how they viewed accountability. The first approach to accountability that the field took was what's known as the legal boundaries approach. The legal boundaries approach is rooted in Woodrow Wilson's article, The Study of Administration. And you have the study of administration on your agenda to read in a future class, and we'll talk about it in a future class. But essentially, Woodrow Wilson, in his study of administration, sets up the idea of a separate study of administration, which is kind of the foundational principles for a discipline of public administration. He argues in his article that if we can separate politics from administration, then we are better able to study what he called the business of doing the work of government. So he creates this politics administration dichotomy. The political side of the house is for the policymakers as they formulate policies. The administrative side of the house is for the administrators who then implement and execute those policies. So we separate out politics and administration. So the assumption there is that administrators are acting ethically when they are doing their job of executing and implementing these programs and policies. Where they may be acting unethically is where they cross the line from administration into politics. And when administrators start playing politics, that's where we have problems with ethics. So we use the politics administration dichotomy and the line between those two concepts as our guide for understanding what is considered ethical, what is considered unethical in terms of the behavior of administrators. That is very black and white, a very simple way of defining unethical behavior, but it is far too simple. And as early as the 1930s, you have public administration scholars such as John Gauss, who pointed out the fact that it's impossible to truly separate politics and administration. Administration bleeds over into politics, and politics bleed over into administration. Administrators not only implement policies, but they also contribute to policy formulation. Administrators advise elected officials, they provide their technical expertise to these elected officials as these elected officials are formulating policy. That is not necessarily a bad thing. And so just because an administrator is on the political side of the equation, helping formulate policies, doesn't mean that they are acting unethically. So it's not as simple and black and white as the politics administration dichotomy. Today, our approach to understanding ethics is a much more contextual approach. Today, we realize that every organization has its own unique culture. And in making sure that administrators are adhering to ethical principles, we have to make sure that those principles are in alignment with the culture of that organization. In essence, there is no longer a one-size-fits-all approach to ethical adherence. Now we have to take the context of the organization's culture into account. So it's a much more muddied, much more convoluted process of ensuring ethical adherence. It is not impossible, but it is more difficult than it was back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where we just relied upon this black and white politics administration dichotomy. So, in essence, ethics are difficult in the public sector. Well, what do we hold people accountable for? One thing we hold them accountable for is fiscal accountability. Fiscal accountability is concerned with whether administrators, agency officials are spending money on the programs they're charged with managing and only on those programs. So essentially, we're asking the question, are people spending public resources, public dollars in the way in which they are supposed to? So the appropriation bill will say this money is being spent on this. Are we spending the money in the legally mandated manner? That's fiscal accountability. That is the most widespread type of accountability. And usually, when we see ethical violations, oftentimes those ethical violations have fiscal components to them. Embezzlement would be an example of a problem with fiscal accountability. Uh, Providing a contract to a family member would be an example of a problem with fiscal accountability. Oftentimes, whenever someone puts private interest above public interest and they're trying to serve their own private financial interests, that's the problem that we have with fiscal accountability. So that's the most common type of accountability we look at. A second type of accountability is process accountability. In process accountability, we are concerned with how agencies are performing their tasks on a daily basis. Here, we are looking primarily at program and policy implementation. So, are they doing an efficient job of spending public resources on implementing these programs and these policies? So, process accountability looks primarily at the question of efficiency of using public resources. Then the third approach to accountability is program accountability, which is concerned with whether a public program is achieving its purpose as defined in law. Program accountability looks at effectiveness. So, how effective is that program? Is this program achieving its goals and its objectives? So, those are just three different ways in which we can look at accountability. By far, the most common type of accountability that we deal with is going to be fiscal accountability. It's also the easiest to measure, it's the one that's the most quantitative. So we are trying to hold people accountable for their actions to make sure that they are adhering to codes of ethics and codes of conduct. The problem is gaining insight into actually being able to see ethical violations. The problem with being able to see ethical violations is that these violations are occurring within public organizations. So if we are not located within those organizations, we probably are not in close enough proximity to see these ethical violations. We need people who are in proximity, people who are within those agencies to point out those ethical violations. In essence, we need whistleblowers. In order to have people be willing to be whistleblowers, they need to feel that they are being protected from reprisal and retribution. If they feel they're being protected from retribution, those whistleblowers will be willing to stay within their agencies and to continue reporting out these ethical violations. However, if they do not feel protected from retribution and reprisal, they're going to exit their agency and move someplace else, and we then lose that insight into the operations of that agency. So we need to promote whistleblowers to remain what we call the voice of ethics within their organization, which means we need to protect those whistleblowers. We protect those whistleblowers by having legislation that is meant to protect them and insulate them from retribution. At the federal level, we have this thing called the Whistleblower Protection Act. The Whistleblower Protection Act allows a federal employee to blow the whistle on an ethical violation that they see. The first place that they can go to blow the whistle under the Whistleblower Protection Act is their own agency's Office of Inspector General. In the Obama administration, Obama had an executive order that created offices of Inspector General in every federal department and federal agency. That Office of Inspector General was there to try and receive these whistleblower claims and investigate these whistleblower claims. Now, that was then and this is now. The Trump administration has gotten rid of a lot of those offices of Inspector General. Those Inspector Generals were some of the first federal employees who were who lost their jobs. And we know we had this big downsizing of about 235,000 federal government positions. The first ones on the chopping block were these inspectors general. So a lot of agencies no longer have a well-staffed office of inspector general. So the second place you can go as a federal employee is the Office of Special Counsel. The Office of Special Counsel was first created back in 1978 in the Civil Service Reform Act and then given independent agency status under the Whistleblower Protection Act. So, under the Whistleblower Protection Act, the OSC, Office of Special Counsel, becomes its own independent agency with its own independent staff and its own independent budget. Once the Whistleblower Protection Act did that, it then allowed the OSC to deal with a lot of their backlog of cases that they had with whistleblowers and actually more effectively and efficiently handle these whistleblower claims. That was then and this is now. One of the first things that the Trump administration did in January was to fire the head of the Office of Special Counsel. I believe it was a man by the name of Dellinger, I believe his name was. He was fired from his position. He then sued, and trial court put a stay on his firing. The Court of Appeals then overruled the trial court and allowed him to remain fired while his case made its way up to the Supreme Court. He then dropped his case when it got to the Supreme Court. And so we never had a full resolution as to whether or not the president has legal authority to get rid of the head of an independent agency like the Office of Special Counsel. The head of the Office of Special Counsel was appointed by a previous president and was confirmed by the Senate. So the question that is there is, can the president fire a Senate-confirmed employee? We don't have an answer to that in terms of this case because the case was dropped. So the Office of Special Counsel no longer has its leader. So if the Office of Special Counsel, you take your case there and you don't get a response from them within 120 days, then the third place you can go is what's called the Merit System Protection Board. Now, the Merit System Protection Board since 1978 has been the organization that is there to protect the merit principles and the merit protections of federal employees. That was then, this is now. Because I believe it was in early February, President Trump fired the head of the Merit System Protection Board and several of the commissioners. Those commissioners have been appointed by previous presidents and confirmed by the Senate. So, in firing these commissioners, the Merit System Protection Board now doesn't have the staffing and the direction that it used to have to hear these whistleblower claims. So, today it's more difficult to blow the whistle at the federal level because you don't have an Office of Inspector General. The OSC is not as responsive as it used to be, and neither is the Merit System Protection Board. But at least in theory, you have those three avenues you can pursue if you want to be a whistleblower and point out ethical violations at the federal level. Fortunately, here in California, for state employees, we have a California Whistleblower Protection Act. That one is still operational. The way in which the California Whistleblower Protection Act works is that if you want to file a whistleblower claim, you can file it with the California State Auditor's Office. If you're a local employee, you can go to your local auditor's office and you can file your claim there. And then where the claim goes from there depends upon what type of employee you are. So, for instance, if you are a Cal State employee, the state auditor's office will investigate your claim and then refer it to the Cal State system, and then protections from retribution and reprisal will then be handled by the Inspector General's office in the Cal State University system. But that's the California Whistleblower Protection Act. I provided for you links in the slide for both the federal act as well as the California Act. We're not going to follow those links because we have limited time tonight, but if you are interested, those links will provide you more information about how those two whistleblower protection acts work at the federal and at the state level. So I think there's very little doubt that in the public sector, the ethical expectations are higher than in the private sector because of the resources we are managing. We are managing public resources. Since we are managing public resources, we do not own those resources. Those resources are owned by the public. So we essentially are operating in a fiduciary capacity in managing those public resources. So by definition, we have to have higher ethical standards. We have to have more ethical rules and regulations. The problem with that is what's known as the shock of ethical upgrade, that whenever someone leaves from the private sector and wants to move into the public sector, they oftentimes feel this shock of ethical upgrade in that they are now being forced to adhere to all these new rules and regulations while at the same time probably getting paid a little bit less money than they got paid in the private sector and getting probably less perks than they got in the private sector. In the other section of this class I teach on Tuesday nights, I had someone who had moved from the private to the public sector very recently. I don't know if any of you have, but this person moved from the private to public sector and he attested to this shock of ethical upgrade. He couldn't believe all of the hoops he had to jump through. For example, he was in procurement, and so he did a lot of the contracts with contractors. He couldn't believe the number of hoops he had to jump through in public contract code here in the public sector here in California. So we do have higher ethical standards and rules in the public as compared to the private sector, which sometimes does make it difficult for us to attract people into the public sector. We really need to strike a balance between ensuring that the public interest is being preserved with our ethical adherence and making sure that we make the public sector an attractive enough vocation to attract people to work in the public sector. And that sometimes is a very difficult balancing act to try and handle. What helps us in that balancing act is when we have leadership that is strongly supportive of the public service. President George H.W. Bush, so Bush the elder, referred to government service as being the highest and the noblest calling. President Bush was a career civil servant, and he really did believe very strongly in the nobility of serving the public. President Obama, when he was running for office in 2008, said one of the primary goals of his presidential campaign was to, quote unquote, try to make government and public service cool again. When you have leaders who are willing to promote the essential nature of the public service, it makes it easier to attract people to the public service despite all these rules and regulations they need to adhere to. It allows people to see what a fulfilling vocation public administration can be and how they can impact the lives of so many people. I spent about 11 years as department chair. And whenever I would go through admission files, I would read all of the statements of interest that everyone would submit with their applications. And I was always struck that down to a person, everyone in one form or another talked about how much they believed in public service and how much they wanted to benefit their communities and how much they want to serve the public interest. So I really do think that in the public sector, we attract people who really do want to make their communities better places to be, and they are willing to work under these stricter ethical standards. Well, what are some of these ethical standards that we have to adhere to in the public sector? We know that public administration is multidisciplinary. We know we have people coming into the public sector from a variety of different types of professional backgrounds. We have engineers, we have scientists, we have finance managers, we have human resource managers. Every one of those people who come in from a profession have their own professional code of conduct. But when they become public administrators, there is one code of conduct that we all share in the discipline, and that's a code of conduct from the American Society for Public Administration. And these 8 principles in the ASPA Code of Conduct form the basis of what you'll be doing then for Canvas essay number 2 that is due next week. So in Canvas essay number 2, of these 8 principles, you are going to select 3 of those principles that you think would either be difficult for you or your organization to implement, and then telling me why you think those would be the most difficult to implement. So, what are those 8 principles that we all share in our code of conduct in public administration? We can see them arrayed on the screen for you there. Number 1 is the public interest. Promote the interests of the public and put service to the public above service to oneself. Public service, public interest should be higher than private interest. In a couple of weeks, we will talk about civil service and we'll talk about where civil service came from. And I'll talk to you about someone by the name of George Washington Plunkett. George Washington Plunkett was an individual who worked in the major political machine of Tammany Hall in New York City. And when he retired from Tammany Hall and did a lot of his work actually from a shoeshine stand, but when he left Tammany Hall, he wrote his memoirs called Plunkett of Tammany Hall. And he gives us an example in Plunkett of Tammany Hall of what he calls honest graft. Now, the word graft for us today is synonymous with corruption. So he's basically saying there is a type of corruption that is considered honest corruption. And he gives us the example that, say, in the course of his duties working for City Hall, he finds out that the city is going to build a park. So he goes out there and buys the plot of land that the park's going to be built on, buys it for a cheap price, then goes to the city and resells it to the city for a handsome profit. He considers that to be honest corruption. He says that he saw his opportunity and he took it. We would say today that that is unethical because he used information that he acquired through his public position for private gain. He essentially put private interest above public interest. And it is kind of funny for us to think about honest graft, honest corruption, but he did make that distinction. He said there's a dishonest corruption. For him, dishonest graft was if you put your hand in the till and took money out and embezzled it, that would be dishonest. And so he kind of drew the line there. But using information from your public position to gain privately, that was okay. That was honest graft and corruption. So that's an example of someone putting private interest above public interest. And that is obviously a violation of our first principle. The second principle is to uphold the Constitution and the law. Respect and support government constitutions and laws while seeking to improve laws and policies to promote the public good. This is why we looked at the Constitution, because our second principle is to uphold that Constitution. Number 3, to promote democratic participation. Inform the public and encourage active engagement in governance, be open, transparent, and responsive, and respect and assist all persons in their dealing with public organizations. This means that we are tearing down the walls between the organization and the public. This means the public will have more avenues in order to demand things and ask us of things, but it's important that we promote that type of democratic participation. Strengthen social equity. Treat all persons with fairness, justice, equality, and respect individual differences, rights, and freedoms. Promote affirmative action and other initiatives to reduce unfairness, injustice, and inequality in society. Social equity is a major principle under the new public administration. It's something that our accrediting body focuses on. It's something that the American Society for Public Administration focuses on as well. Fully inform and advise. We talked about this with the principal-agent relationship. Provide accurate, honest, comprehensive, and timely information and advice to elected and appointed officials and governing board members and to staff members in your organization. Number 6, demonstrate personal integrity. Adhere to the highest standards of conduct to inspire public confidence and trust in public service. The Bennington and Moore article talked about public value and how, as public managers, we need to add public value to what we do. We can add that public value by working in what's called an expository role. When we work in an expository role, we are role modeling integrity to the people that we are dealing with, to our citizens. So if we demonstrate personal integrity, by doing that, we can then build trust among the public, not only in us as administrators, but in our agencies as well. Speaking of agencies, number 7 is to promote ethical organizations. Strive to attain the highest standards of ethics, stewardship, and public service in organizations that serve the public. Not only do we need to be ethical, but we need to work toward making our organizations ethical as well. And you'll talk more about creating an ethical organization when you take PPA 660, Organization Theory and Behavior. And then number 8, to advance professional excellence. Strengthen personal capabilities to act competently and ethically, and encourage the professional development of others. That's a very important part of that tenet, because what we are doing there is we're essentially preparing new generations for leadership. After COVID, we saw a lot of people leave the public sector for a variety of reasons. A lot of those people were in upper leadership and management positions. Once you hollow out those positions, you need to have younger employees who are able and willing to step into those leadership positions. They're only able and willing to do so if they have received this professional development throughout their careers. That is succession planning. We need to have good succession plans in our organizations. So those are the 8 ethical principles that we as public administrators are required to adhere to under the American Society for Public Administration. Now, one major aspect, I know we're running out of time, so I'll try and do it quickly, but one major aspect of ethical adherence is obviously transparency. And we hear of that word transparency thrown around a lot in the public sector. We always want to be transparent. We tend to be required to be transparent here in a state like California. California has a lot of sunshine laws that are required so that the public can gain insight into the decision-making process of what's going on in the public sector. Some of these laws you're probably familiar with. Some apply more to elected officials as opposed to administrators. But one of the major ones is the Brown Act. The Brown Act is a requirement here in California that public decisions be made in public. So if you have a city council or you have a governing board, and a majority of that council or that board will be meeting together, that meeting must be an open meeting. It must be conducted in public. That also includes one-on-one interactions between multiple members of a city council. So if you have one member of city council emails another one about an issue within the jurisdiction of the city, then that second person contacts a third person who then contacts the fourth person. Even though they are making one-on-one contact, that is considered to be a serial meeting. And that is still covered under this open meetings requirement in the Brown Act. So your decisions need to be made in public. The agendas for those meetings need to be published at least 72 hours in advance. That's so members of the public know what issues are being discussed at that meeting so they can show up and make public comment. At your meetings, you need to have a public comment period so that members of the public can comment on agenda items as well as non-agenda items. However, if you have a member of the public who is commenting on a non-agenda item, the members of that governing board or that city council may not respond to those comments because that would be discussing something that's not on the agenda. You are only allowed to discuss issues that are published on that agenda. Certain issues can be done outside of open public session and can be done in closed session. So typically, if you have some personnel types of decisions, so someone is being dismissed for some type of malfeasance or misfeasance, that dismissal can be done in closed session. However, the vote on that dismissal would need to be reported out in open session. Now, you wouldn't report it out with the person's name for privacy reasons. You would have an employee number, but that vote would have to be reported out. Conversations you have with legal counsel, that can be done in closed session as well. When I was on the school board, there was a school shooting, not in my district, but in the high school district, which all of our schools fed into that high school district. And so we had a lot of meetings on school safety. Those school safety meetings, we oftentimes had those meetings with the sheriff's department in closed session because you don't want to show your vulnerabilities to people in open session because that just makes your facilities a lot more vulnerable. Diego says Brown Act makes city meetings be conducted in public. If a member of the public is not able to attend in person, is there a responsibility of the city to provide alternate formats? Yes, there is. Or as long as the physical location is open, that fulfills a virtual phone. Yeah, you need to have some provisions. And so people can submit written comments in advance if they would like to, if they cannot attend. A lot of these meetings are being done on Zoom. And so if you're conducting your meeting during Zoom, public comments can be done in person. They can also be done on Zoom as well. Sue Beasley said their council member couldn't zoom into a council meeting because he was on a cruise in a different country. We actually had a similar situation on my school board where we had one of our members who was on a cruise and so didn't have internet access. And so they were excused from that meeting. I mean, we went on with the meeting, they were excused from the meeting. But then at a follow-up meeting, we would have to pass a board resolution that officially excused them from the meeting if they still wanted to get their stipend. And there was a small monthly stipend of like $120 or something like that that was meant to pay for gas to go to different events. Yeah, I actually had a situation once when I was on the school board. I was leading a site visit to a school in Michigan, and the the board had decided to have a meeting. They had added a meeting to the schedule after I had already committed to do this site visit. So I actually attended through Zoom from Michigan for this board meeting, but it was a real hassle to say the least. So we had to disclose in advance on the agenda that I would be teleconferencing in for it. At the hotel, I had to talk to the hotel manager so that we placed a notice on the front door of the hotel saying that I was a member of this board and I was participating in this meeting from this time to this time, and I would be zooming in from this location in the hotel. Then that room in the hotel, I had to put a sign up on the door so that people could come in if they wanted to, and they could virtually attend that meeting as well. I know it sounds really crazy, but those were the pre-COVID requirements in the Brown Act that we had to do because the public had to have notice of where I was attending that meeting from and then have the opportunity to attend that meeting from that location. Now, obviously, it was outside of Detroit, Michigan. It was 10 degrees below zero that evening. Actually, that day that we were going to visit the school was closed for the first time in 120 years because of cold weather. It was that bad. So no one was coming to attend that meeting in Michigan. But that's what we had to do pre-COVID. That was pre-COVID. Then during COVID, Governor Newsom loosened up a lot of those regulations. So you don't have to do that anymore after those COVID types of changes. But before COVID, yeah, we actually had to go through all of that. Um, well, that's interesting that Whittier is currently failing to provide Zoom links for our city council meetings after the ice raids. Very interesting. Yeah, it is quite a coincidence, perhaps. And yeah, I agree that putting that sign up on the door was crazy to do, but we had to do it to be in compliance with the Brown Act. So the Brown Act is there for the purpose of transparency. We also have the California Public Records Act, and it is there to allow members of the public to submit a public records request. If you are working in an agency and you deal with these public records requests, you know just how time consuming they can be. So, a member of the public can request documentation dealing with a certain issue that they are interested in. So, a contract was awarded, and they have questions about why that contract was awarded to that bidder. And so, they'll put in a public records request for all documentation and correspondence dealing with the awarding of that contract. The city would then have 10 days to respond to that public records request and acknowledge that they received it, and then give a timeline for when they were able to provide all the documentation that is responsive to that request. Now, there could be a lot of documentation. We got one public records request that dealt with the closing of a facility. The process of closing that facility was about a 10-year process. So the district had to go back and get all the documentation over a 10-year period of time. That included any correspondence that was done by board members with the superintendent. If that correspondence was done on a private, smartphone through text messages, those text messages would have to be provided as documentation as well. It was a major undertaking. You can imagine how difficult it was to get 10 years of information on that closing of that school. So it really does take you a lot of time and takes a lot of effort. Yeah, it says made requests like that. Would hate to be on the other end, but it's good public service. It is good public service. It's important that people have the opportunity to gain access to this information, but indeed, it does take a whole lot of time and a lot of resources to respond to. We also have conflict of interest provisions here in California to make sure that when people are participating in making decisions, that they do not have a conflict of interest with the decision that they are making. For reportable positions, these are elected officials, but these are also management positions. So, for example, in the Cal State system, if you are what do they call them? They call them MPPs, I think. So, if you're a provost or you're a vice provost or you're a dean, or an associate dean, you are in a reportable position, you have to submit a Form 700, which shows all the potential conflicts of interest that you could have so the public knows what those potential conflicts are. So if you do have a conflict, you should be recusing yourself from that discussion and from that vote. Hopefully, elected officials and managers are recusing themselves from those types of discussions. That doesn't always happen. And I know a case from a board member in a district, I won't say where, but a few years ago, who actually had just taken a new job with a law firm. And the day after she took the job at the law firm, that law firm was on the agenda to be approved to be on retainer with the district. And she voted on that contract, even though she was working at that time for the law firm. She ended up getting fined $4,000 for violating that conflict of interest prohibition. So it's serious business. And the Fair Political Practices Commission, the Attorney General's office, takes conflict of interest very, very seriously. And the last minute that we have, just kind of wrap this up. I know we're out of time, but accountability in the public sector really does require striking a balance. We have to strike a balance between having these ethical rules and regulations and then freeing up our administrators to take bold and innovative actions so they can do the job of the public well. We really need to also balance these external rules and regulations with the internal training and character of our administrators. If we have administrators who are not predisposed to act in an ethical manner, all the ethical rules in the world will probably not get them to act ethically. Fortunately, as I said, in my experience, people who go through this program, they have the character to operate within the public interest. And they are in a public administration program for all of the right reasons. I know we're out of time, but this is just a very brief introduction into the issue of public sector accountability and ethics. This just kind of gets you started with a foundation that you will then build on in all of your future courses in the program. Okay, I'm sorry I ran you a little bit late tonight. I apologize for that. Any last second questions or comments on what we have talked about this evening?
No, thank you so much for answering all my questions, by the way. I know that
Sure.
I tend to throw a lot in the chat. So I
Oh, that
appreciate you taking the time answering
Oh,
them.
sure. That's great. I'm glad you do that, and you should continue to do that because I mean that's what we need. Those are all great questions, and those are great questions that then prompt us to add additional information to clarify things. So, no need to apologize. You should keep doing that through all of our future class sessions. That's great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I will have this recording up on our site by tomorrow morning. Remember, you've got the draft advancement to candidacy due next week, as well as Canvas essay number 2. As always, any questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, enjoy your upcoming weekend, and I'll see you again next Thursday.
Have a good night. Thank you.
Have a good night. Take care.
Bye bye.